Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to Professor Walsh. Welcome to the research seminar titled Look Who's Talking, the Place of Educational Research in Promoting Interdisciplinarity. My name is Crystal, and I am the MC of today. The seminar today will look into the role of educational research in promoting and enhancing interdisciplinarity. It is delivered by Professor Steve Walsh, Visiting Professor and Research Leader, Academic Unit of Teacher Education and Learning Leadership of the faculty. Before starting this session, I would like to introduce some house rules. First of all, in order to avoid unnecessary noise throughout the session, we have muted all of you as the default setting. In the Q&A session, if you would like to ask questions, please type your questions in the chat box and send them to everyone so that Professor Walsh and I can help you to ask the questions. Please note that the raise hand function will not be responded. Please also note that the whole session will be recorded for uploading onto different online platforms of the faculty. For the rundown of today, Professor Steve Walsh will first deliver the seminar for 50 minutes. After that, there will be around 10 minutes for the Q&A session. So may I now invite Professor Walsh to start the seminar. Professor Walsh, please, and please also share your screen.
Okay, thanks very much, Crystal, and nice to see some familiar faces at least here. It's always good to see people, I think, when you're doing this kind of thing. We've been working, sorry, let me just get this thing started. We've been working in this kind of environment for some time now, and it's really important, actually, I think all of you would agree, to be able to get some feedback from people. So I just encourage you, to turn your video on some of the time. Let me see a few familiar faces so I know who I'm talking to. This is the last seminar for me as visiting professor at the university. So I'm really grateful to the faculty to have hosted me for the last, where are we now, about 18 months, and for the opportunity to give one final seminar, which Professor Goodwin asked me to give. And she said, please make it wide in its appeal, which was a little bit of a challenge because we do cover a wide range of disciplines and contexts in the faculty. I'm also pleased just to let you know that this isn't the end of the road for me in terms of my connections with Hong Kong University, because I'm delighted to let you know that I will be coming back in a visiting capacity for the next 3 or 4 years. So that will mean, I guess, 1 or 2 visits per year for the next 3 or 4 years. So I'll get a chance to see you again. And I'm really pleased about that because I left in February for what I thought was going to be a few weeks. And I'm still in the UK owing to the current situation. So today's talk, Look Who's Talking. Let me explain the Look Who's Talking bit. Look Who's Talking works on 2 levels. Look Who's Talking works on the level of educational research has something to offer. So please, other disciplines, listen to us. And the other level is that it works on the level of understanding interdisciplinary research from a discourse perspective. So I'm going to be looking at discourse and collaboration and those kinds of things in this as a way of understanding how educational research might have a role to play in promoting interdisciplinarity. And I think it's fair to say, I've got some colleagues, I can see colleagues here, my colleagues and early career researchers would agree with me that when we apply for funding and new projects, the emphasis is very much on interdisciplinary research. Funders want different disciplines to come together, and they want them to work together to show new understandings of old problems, or perhaps to develop new knowledge. And we're in a situation right now, aren't we, where this kind of research is happening. Here in the UK, every day on the news, we hear from scientists informing government planning and policy on the COVID situation. And they come from a range of disciplines. They come from virology, epidemiology, behavioral scientists, psychologists, educationists, and they're all working together in a situation which is probably one of the most challenging that we've faced in the last however many years. So we need this kind of research, and we need to think about how we might play a role. So this is the overview of what I want to do with you today. I want to talk a little bit about what do we mean by disciplines, some of the current debates, how do we achieve success, what's the place of educational research, a few examples of projects that I've worked on, and then a few predictions for the future. So that's the overall structure of what I want to do with you. So I think the first thing to say is that we all see the world differently. As researchers, we have different ways of looking at the world. We have different epistemological and ontological assumptions about what research is and how it should be done, about what knowledge is and what constitutes knowledge in the current climate. And so that has an impact on the methodologies we use, the ways in which we study our discipline. It varies from one discipline to another. I think it's very true to say that we don't always speak the same language, and we use the same language to mean different things. So there's a whole linguistic issue here, which we need to think about, and a communication issue. When you look at the research on interdisciplinarity, you'll find that one of the key issues, if you like, is that we have strong disciplinary allegiance, which is fine. I mean, we should be loyal to our discipline, but we also need to be flexible enough and open enough to listen to other people from other disciplines as a way of understanding our world. So the kind of parallel that comes to my mind here from my early days as a researcher is the work of Schumann, who looked at culture, and he explained that some people are better at learning languages than others because they have what he calls cultural permeability. In other words, they can transfer their thinking and their view of the world from one culture to another quite easily. Other people have what he called cultural impermeability, which was like where you are very locked into your culture and your view of the world. And I think these ideas transcend into interdisciplinary research. We need to be open-minded enough to listen to other people and look at the ways in which they see the world as a way of understanding common problems. So here's an example. Here's some data taken from a research meeting. I'm going to be referring to some work by two good friends of mine and colleagues, Sung-Suk Choi, who's from Korea, and Keith Richards, who's recently retired from the University of Warwick. Sung-Suk works at the University of Edinburgh, and they have produced a book last year, which I'll reference in a minute, called Interdisciplinary Discourse, and I'll show you that book in a minute. So this is an extract taken from their work. It's a conversation between a group of researchers from different disciplines. We've got statisticians, biologists, and a couple of other here. And this is using conversation analysis. So I'm not going to go into the detail of what these strange symbols mean. Some of you will be familiar with this. But what's interesting here is the way in which they are trying to achieve understanding of their different disciplines. And they're looking at data, and the question is, do we need to go back and look at the data again? And what's interesting is when you get down to sort of 7, 8 onwards here, they're talking about publishing their work, and we hear Joan saying it's not a problem when we publish it, that we need, and Lucy says in line 10 they're unlikely to read it back. And this is the interesting bit in 12, 13 and 14. Exactly. I mean, if a biologist reads it, they won't even think about it. But if a statistician reads it, they'll tell you it's wrong, the analysis and theory. So here we have two different views, looking at the same data, thinking about publication, and immediately we see the issues at stake here, that it depends which audience you're talking to the kind of understanding they're going to take from it, and also the particular spin they might put on the data. And I can give you another example from my own experience when I went to do a viva at the University of Nottingham, and the PhD student involved in the viva had done a really nice action research project, but she'd used a little bit of what she called descriptive statistics in this project. And when I went into the pre-viva meeting, the internal examiner, who was American, said, boy, do we got a problem here. And he had focused on the statistics because he was a quantitative researcher, which was only a small part of the study. And he kind of ignored the bigger picture of what was going on in the action research. So we had a conversation about this to come to some understanding before we could even start examining the thesis. And this is two researchers from the same discipline, but with different perspectives on the world, different ontological and epistemological backgrounds and understandings. So that's just a kind of by way of example. I'm going to give you a few definitions now. Just read these. I'm not going to read them aloud, but just focus on the words in red. Okay, a second one. And a third one. So you get, from that, you get things like conceptual models being linked, integrating theoretical frameworks, range of methodologies being used, the solving of problems and finding solutions, maybe not even solving problems, but maybe raising problems is a key element of this work. It's not always about solving it, but it's actually articulating what the problem might be or what the issue is from a range of perspectives. And that's where interdisciplinary research has its strength. And this one obviously is right up my street. You can see the words that I'm going to focus on here, the dialogue and the interaction between two or more disciplines, and the way in which that interaction is understood and examined. And just to finish with, let me give you a more everyday sense of this. And that we are, in Hong Kong, and food is important. So this is a culinary metaphor for looking at interdisciplinary research. I think this metaphor is very powerful and really helps us understand how things like multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, and what they're now referring to as transdisciplinary, which is where we actually create trans disciplines, not just one discipline, but a new discipline, which is emerging from several disciplines. So I'm thinking here of things like artificial intelligence, which relies on different disciplines working together, nanotechnology and nanoscience, all that work. And what's happening, because researchers are coming together from different backgrounds, is they are creating new disciplines, new subject areas. And this is even being transferred to the school level. I know, for example, that in Scotland, I think they're going to stop using traditional subject distinctions like physics, chemistry, and biology. These will become subject areas. This is already happening in the States, isn't it? So we have things like liberal studies and so on. So from the research that's going on, this is actually having a knock-on effect in knowledge bases, which has a consequence for teaching and learning at both school and university level. So this kind of broader approach to disciplines, I think, is very much a positive thing, but it's also something we need to understand more fully how it gets done. How does the process of transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary research differ from research within one discipline? And that's, I think, where educational research can play a role. We also have this distinction, which is quite nice, between narrow and broad interdisciplinarity. So you can see how certain sciences might work together quite comfortably, whereas if you bring a different discipline in, there might be a little bit of a clash of cultures, you might say, between, for example, social scientists and, say, what we might call pure scientists, or between people from a humanities background and social scientists, and then again pure scientists. So there's a narrow versus a broad interdisciplinary distinction. So why do it? Well, I mean, I think there are a number of reasons. I work very much in educational linguistics, applied linguistics, and the definition of applied linguistics from a long time ago by Chris Brumfitt is it's a discipline which looks at solving real world problems where language and communication are important, which to me is pretty well all situations, because those things are important in understanding and in developing new knowledge. Investigating old problems in a new way, I think that's another reason. If you look at hot topics, which are always in the news and always being talked about, like nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, as I've said, conflict, terrorism, they're nearly always interdisciplinary. They don't rely on evidence from one discipline. I've mentioned the funding thing. And of course, the big one is the last one, to advance theory, knowledge, or method. We're trying always to push back the barriers and find new ways of understanding new knowledge bases or new ways of looking at a particular issue. So defining success, this is more difficult. And I'm quoting here from Choi and Richard's earlier work. They look at three broad sets of factor. They look at contextual factors, intellectual, and interpersonal. And I think probably you need a good mix of these. The contextual one, I think, is really important. Do we have adequate institutional support? And I'm pleased to see that Hong Kong University has just announced in a recent bulk email a building plan which includes a centre to promote interdisciplinary research. Now, I can't remember the name of it, but I'm just doing this from memory, but it was nice to see that going out across the university. There is going to be a dedicated space for this kind of activity. We also need to think about funding. I mean, people obviously worry about their careers, they're having adequate funding, publishing widely enough, and so on. These are genuine, real concerns. So people have to feel safe that they can do the research and that it won't affect their future development. Obviously, the intellectual factors here, especially complementarity of skills and knowledge, I think that's really important. Is there a basis for working together across disciplines? I mean, sometimes people want to work together because they're friends or because they like each other. It might not necessarily be a good enough reason intellectually for a research project to go ahead. And of course we need, and this is really crucial, and any of the work that's been done on this, and I've read quite a bit in the last couple of weeks of the research on interdisciplinary research, there's at least 500 papers now of studies looking at interdisciplinary research. This last group of factors seems to be the most important. The interpersonal, the ability to understand each other, to have respect for one another, and to engage with different perspectives. I think this is really, really fundamental to success of any project. Okay, so a few kind of quotes to support that. This one here is about respect for scientific process. I can think of an example in my own career again, where a group of conversation analysts were kind of putting down quantitative research methods and saying they didn't really reveal anything, and that conversation analysis was the only way to study discourse. You can't look at it in a more quantitative way. You know, I mean, that is clearly not correct, and it's not respectful. We don't want that kind of attitude. And it's simply not possible to collaborate if you have that mindset. So we need to have respect. We need to have a process and respect that process. We need interesting topics, and we need the ability to make mistakes gracefully. I like that last bit, you know. Research isn't perfect, and we do make mistakes. We do get things wrong. It's happening all the time with COVID right now. Mistakes are being made, lessons are being learned, changes are happening on a daily basis almost. So, you know, we've got to make mistakes to learn, and that comes from education, doesn't it? You know, the good learners are learners who take risks, who make mistakes, they get things wrong, but they learn from that. And I think, again, that's what kind of where education comes in. Yeah, there's more. I mean, I won't go through all this in detail. You can read this later, perhaps. Let's think a bit more now about the place of education, educational research in interdisciplinary research. There are a few things. This is just from my own thoughts, really. We have a long tradition in understanding difference and diversity. It's one of the pillars of educational research. We look at this a lot. We have done it over many years. We've got a long tradition in it. I think the second one is clearly important, that process is equally important as product. We're not always just interested in what's the result. We're very interested in the journey, how we get there. So process plays a key part in the sort of work that we do. We also have, if you look at educational research, a very wide range of ontological and epistemological, can't say that word today, traditions, which make it more flexible and more adaptable to different contexts. We've looked, for example, at things relating to identity, agency, and context. In educational research, context is everything, right? You can't understand an issue in education without a clear understanding of the context. And context can operate at many levels, the macro, the micro, the meta. There's different ways of looking at it, but we always take that into account. And I think that's a significant aspect of our work, and it's something that we can help other disciplines do, perhaps in more detail. And the last one is really for our own benefit. I think educational research gets buried very often, and by working across disciplines, it's easier to raise the visibility of what we do and to show other disciplines how we've got something to say, a contribution to make, and a role to play. So there are many reasons. Here's a quote from a biologist who decided to work across disciplines. I'm just going to read this one with you because I think it's pretty powerful. She says, "I've sort of been driven outside my department to look for people to interact with because my colleagues are not interested in interacting. That is my perception. If I came into a department where people were interested in interactions among biologists, I may never have set foot outside the department. It's hard for me to tell. But it's one of the worst in terms of people interacting with the rest of the campus. Most of my colleagues are not known. Even people who've been there for 30 years aren't known to the rest of the campus." So there is a danger in operating in what are often referred to as silos. You know, a silo is a place where we store things. We store liquids in big quantities. We store grain like rice and wheat and things like that. These are silos. These are the big containers which are very much constrained by physical barriers. And one of the kind of criticisms of discipline-specific research is that they operate in silos. They don't move outside, they don't share, they don't look at other ways of seeing the world. And I think that's something we need to be aware of and be resist really. So this one is emphasizing collaboration. And it sort of it brings to mind my thinking about current theories of learning, for example. So sociocultural theories of learning and teaching are prevalent right now in our discipline, I would say. When you read current research papers on education, many of them draw upon sociocultural theories, which emphasizes things like collaboration, co-construction, mediation, these kinds of things that we're all very familiar with. And I think we have a lot to offer other disciplines because of that understanding we have of how collaboration works. How do people actually jointly create understandings together? How does that process actually work? And of course, we've now got 21st century skills, which is a kind of international, global notion of what should be happening in the workplace. And 21st century skills emphasize teamwork, collaboration, communication, technology, the use of technology, mediating understandings by using the right tools. And again, we've been working on this for a long time in the field of education. I'm just going to focus on the last part of this here, this quote. For interdisciplinary research to be effective, the conditions must be created in which appropriate interactions can be fostered. So again, this notion of understandings and interactions being fostered between researchers. What does that mean? Let's unpack this a little bit. What do we mean by appropriate interactions? Some people think that it's just about learning to talk the talk of a particular subject. You know, we need the vocabulary, and we need to use that vocabulary in the same way. But it's much more subtle than that. It's much more nuanced, we might say. It's at the level of communication, interaction, co-construction. And I think, as I said, we do have far more sophisticated understandings of these concepts. And my mind goes here to an area of research which has been active for some time now, content and language integrated learning, which we're quite well known for in our faculty. So English medium instruction is obviously a big thing in Hong Kong, for example. It's becoming bigger internationally. And there is a feeling amongst subject teachers, like, you know, physics teachers or biology teachers, that they are not language teachers. They are subject specific teachers, and their role is not to teach the language of the discipline. But there is another side to that coin, which says that every teacher is a language teacher. And teaching language means far more than teaching the vocabulary of the discipline. Although that's important, we need to know how to communicate, how to create meanings together of our discipline. And I think that's going to become much more important in the future. I'll say more about that later on. So let's have a look at the work of Choi and Richards then. So this is Sung Suk and Keith. They look at discourses from different disciplines, and the data is a large corpus of research meetings with different researchers from different disciplines talking together on a range of projects. So they're really focusing on how does interdisciplinary research get done. Their database, as I've said, is that these meetings. Here's the book, by the way, if you want to get. I'm sure they'll be very pleased if you want to go and rush out and buy it. This is the work that they've been doing for some years, and it's culminated in the book which came out last year. So let's just have a quick look at some of the things they're saying in this piece of work. So one of the things they focus on is how do people negotiate epistemic differences? So epistemics is all about how we understand knowledge, our view of knowledge in our discipline. What does it mean? What constitutes knowledge in a particular field? And obviously, when there are differences, they need to be negotiated. And it's not just a question of one person explaining what their epistemic base is to another. It's about coming together and coming to common understandings. So we need to understand these interactions. How do people deal with epistemics? How do they deal with differences? How do they come to a common understanding? This is quite nice. The material, culture, objects, and the move can only be understood in these kinds of collaborative contexts. So we need people with different and varied disciplinary experience, but also linguistic expertise. And we need multicultural and multilingual collaborations with some watertight method of object analysis. Now, what that's saying to me is that people from different backgrounds, educational, discipline, cultural, and linguistic backgrounds, need to have one thing in common, which is a methodology, a way of analysing and looking at the data. And as long as we have a watertight method, which we all subscribe to, we can do the work together. But it's interesting, isn't it, that they quote these different backgrounds that are needed to make this work. This is a kind of sailing metaphor here. Revisiting old territory. There's a grave risk of sailing around certain buoys again, and there's a whole ocean that we don't know anything about. In other words, we bring people together and we look at the same issues from a multidisciplinary perspective, but we're missing the bigger picture. We're missing the ocean, what's going on out there in a bigger sense. And I think what I've found when I've done this kind of work is that we make assumptions about what people know and what their understandings are, and very often those assumptions are completely wrong. And we really need to talk together to understand where we're coming from. So what we're interested in is the last bit here, the newer stories. There might be some newer stories out there that we don't know anything about yet. And of course, there is a prediction, isn't there, right now, that young people currently in school and going on to university will be doing jobs in the future that don't exist right now. We don't even know what those jobs are. So, research has a role to play in all of that. Here's a nice one between the difference between hard and soft science. I wonder if the scientists here could tell us what they think is missing. So this is coming from a social scientist talking to what you might call hard scientists, people who do proper research in their eyes. And then this nice quote: "What would you like? I mean, what would you like the softies to give you? The soft scientists." Now, this is kind of tough stuff, really, because we all, as I've said, have allegiance to our discipline and we believe in it. But I know from supervising many PhD students that the number of PhDs I've seen and read, which include large amounts of numerical data and do so to make it more scientific. And that data is very often not the most interesting data. It's quite fascinating how we have, even people who've been doing this for a long time, have this perspective of what the difference between hard and soft science actually is. Here's an example, just looking at one word in the discourse of people from different disciplines and how this word "so" is functioning in a number of different ways. And if you listen to interviews at the minute, you'll find that where people, I'm listening to interviews all the time here in the UK because they're interviewing politicians, 20, 30 a day. And where politicians and, formal interviews used to start with the word "well," it seems to have been replaced with "so." So many openings in interviews start with "so." And I'm not quite sure why. If we have corpus linguists amongst us, they might be able to tell us why. But it clearly does different work according to where it's being used and how it's being used. And one of the nice things about this particular example here is the ways in which ideas are collaboratively constructed. I've got to quote someone, I'm just trying to find it. Yeah, Neil Mercer calls this cumulative talk, in the sense that understandings are being created in a cumulative way. So you get "so" at the beginning here, and we get that first turn, and then Joan comes in with, so when you say the first few iterations, she's adding something to what Tim has said, and then it goes on, and it's cumulative. In other words, by using this discourse marker, I would say this is a discourse marker, we are co-constructing and collaboratively creating understandings. And they've got lots of really nice examples like this, not just using the word so, but this notion of cumulative talk, collectively understanding one another is a really nice one. I'll say a little bit more about that in just a minute. So a few examples. How are we doing for time? Okay, we're not too bad. I'm just going to show you some examples of work that my own experience of doing interdisciplinary research, and then we'll just look at the future, and then it's time for questions. So first of all, let me just run through this little model here by Hamilton et al. 2009. And this is quite nice because I think it illustrates the issues that we have when doing interdisciplinary research. The first stage is very much about information exchange. It's single discipline orientated. It's almost competitive. It's almost a competitive stage where we are trying to sort of show allegiance to our discipline and explain that to a different discipline. Stage 2 is much more about understanding other disciplines and learning to live with one another. I like this little bit here. Competition is replaced with coexistence. People are learning to work together and understand different perspectives. And then the final stage is where we have much more communication, we have much more listening and reflection, and we're motivated in genuine interest in a subject, in the new discipline that's been created by working together. So that is as much of interest to us as completing the research, completing the task. And they say that coexistence here is replaced by integration. Now that's you remember the metaphor I showed you of, oh, sorry, I don't want that yet. Yeah, the metaphor, the food metaphor. Stage 3 is the soup, right? That's when everything is working together and it's impossible to distinguish one discipline from another. I don't know if we ever get to that stage, quite frankly. I'm not sure that we do. This might be an ideal stage. But what Choi and Richards do, they make this a little bit more simple. They look at knowledge as being two distinct things. The first one, knowledge 1, is when we constructively exchange ideas. Constructively exchange. It's all about exchanging ideas constructively. But stage 2 is what they call knowledge 2, is when knowledge is collaboratively constructed. So there's a construction where we exchange, and there's a construction of knowledge where we collaborate. And it's clearly the collaboration that's important. And this brings to mind some work that I've quoted before. Basil Bernstein, who works at the University of London, he talks about knowledge as having vertical and horizontal orientations. So if you take a discipline like medicine, biology, physics, the hierarchy of knowledge is very much a vertical one. You need to know A before you can do B. You can't do C until you've mastered B. So concepts, ideas, and understandings, which, by the way, tend to be belonging to very well-established disciplines that have been going for hundreds of years. Education is quite new, quite a new discipline, right? So we have more of a horizontal orientation to knowledge, where knowledge is not so black and white. I mean, in medicine, you simply have to learn, you know, the physiology of the human body. There's no black and white, there's no gray areas. It's black and white. You know, you have to know it, and you have to learn it in that way. That's my understanding anyway. Whereas something like education and social sciences, applied linguistics and so on, understandings are much more gray. They're still open for dispute. They're still not, we're not sure of what the actual truth is yet. We're still debating, we're still discussing. So I think this is quite a nice kind of way of thinking about the process and the different stages. But some examples. So the biggest one I was ever involved in was just before I came to Newcastle. This was at Queen's University, Belfast. It was a £1.25 million project funded by the Department for Education and Learning in Northern Ireland. And we were looking at interprofessional education in the training of doctors, dentists, nurses, and pharmacists. So going back to what I was saying earlier, you would expect these are narrowly connected. In other words, they come from a medical background. They have similar orientations to knowledge and theory, and yet the talk and the interactions between these different groups showed massive misunderstandings and massive miscommunications about particular common issues. Doctors, dentists, nurses, and pharmacists were not talking the same talk. They were talking a different language. And so the project was very much focusing on their interactions. We recorded them in a whole range of settings, including operating theatres. So the ethics were massive for this project. But the main finding, and by the way, I didn't see the end of this because I had to leave in 2007 to join Newcastle. So I had to walk away from what was a really fascinating project. But it was basically, they showed how important interaction and collaboration really are in these settings where people are working in teams, and how important it is to really make your subject knowledge explicit. So one of the challenges facing us in the future, I think, is communicating our research to a wider range of disciplines. We're going to have to be able to make our research comprehensible to people from a wide range of disciplines. And that, I see that as a challenge, but also, an opportunity. A second one, this was a project at Newcastle, the Newcastle University Corpus of Academic Spoken English. And we were looking at small group interactions here. We were looking at how understandings were being created across 3 faculties. So we had medical science, arts, humanities, arts and social science, and then engineering. And what was really fascinating, we used 2 different methodologies. We used corpus linguistics, which is highly quantitative, and we used conversation analysis. But what we noticed hugely is how interactional competence varies according to discipline. So the education of an engineer and the discourse of that education is massively different from the education of an English graduate. They use a completely different language set, a completely different set of interactions. So there are massive implications from this research in terms of how we teach and learn in small groups. This is my most recent project, where I was delighted to be invited to do a keynote at the American Dental Education Association and European Dental Education Association meeting in Italy last year. And the question here was, what can dentistry learn from other disciplines? It was a specific attempt to promote and encourage and learn about what we call transprofessional education. And I don't know if I can show you this. Will this work? This is the kind of paper that we published here. So that's available now in the Journal of Dental Education. So, for the first time in my life, I am being published in a dental education journal, which is interesting. Now I've just lost the share here, sorry. Get this back. Okay, sorry. Sorry about this. There we go. Okay, so I think there is massive potential from that project to link education with other disciplines. And note there that law was involved in that one, in this project. And one project which hasn't started yet, this is something I'm talking about right now with colleagues here, is to work with lawyers and look at how judicial review has changed over time. Judicial review These are the decisions that judges make in big cases, big legal cases. And these are published because they're in the public domain, and we can get access to these published cases and have a look. How has the language of judicial review changed over a long period of time, 30 years? And for this, we're going to be using corpus linguistics with critical discourse analysis. Okay, I'll skip this one. I'm looking at the time. Let's think about the future. Where is this all going to go? Now, these are just my own predictions based on 2 weeks of reading, some experience of doing interdisciplinary research. So, you know, this is very much preliminary predictions. I think, as I've already hinted at, there will be new disciplines emerging out of this kind of research. There will be a merging of old disciplines. I think there will be, and I hope there will be, an opening up of new methodologies, which perhaps allow old issues to be studied in a different way. Now, I think one of the jobs of all of us as researchers is to challenge current methods and methodologies, and not necessarily always follow what's perceived as, you know, accepted wisdom. I think there are things that we could be doing to challenge the ways in which we do things. For example, conversation analysts would tell you you can't mix conversation analysis with another methodology. And I've published 2 papers now, one journal paper and another conference paper, where we use corpus linguistics and CA together. And I think we need to experiment more, because once you start mixing methods, you get very different understandings and very different results. Yeah, I think the last point here, big data is always in the news at the minute when you look at educational research. Funders are, I think it's quite widely accepted that funders are more likely to fund projects where big data is being used, so larger data sets. But I think we need to sort of juxtapose that with smaller case studies. So have the big data to provide the landscape, but then against the landscape, let's have some smaller case studies to show the detail. I think this is a good practice, and it's something which would easily work across disciplines. We need probably to have new understandings of what we mean by evidence. What do we understand from our data? What is the compelling argument for the results that we publish? We've got societal challenges always. We've got the globalization challenge. We've got immigration and emigration issues. We've got the COVID situation right now. Many things happening in society which need to be looked at from a range of perspectives. And I think educational research has a big role to play in this. Impact is becoming a bigger and bigger agenda item in research, and that's likely to continue, because what people are looking for is value for money. What is this research telling us? What's it showing us? What's the impact? What's the big so what of this particular study? And I think impact will increase when we work across disciplines. And I think there is massive potential to have PhDs from several disciplines working together. And of course that creates supervisory issues, but this is a challenge and an opportunity, and not one that we should shy away from. What I've tried to show in this talk is the way in which interdisciplinarity actually happens, the process, and we need to look at the words, the interactions, the communication to get that understanding. In the same way, I would argue that we can't really understand how people learn by, by observing them in a classroom. We can understand learning by listening to what they say, what they do, their actions, and so on. And I think that's true of research as well, that we need to study research processes by looking at the ways in which people communicate and interact, and the ways in which we need to communicate perhaps in a more, not every day, but a more discipline-wide way, rather than talking only to our community. I think we need to talk across communities much more. Education itself probably needs to be redefined to include other things such as professional development, transprofessional learning, and so on. Rather than simply thinking about education in a very narrow way, we probably need to broaden that up to give it more appeal and to allow it to work across disciplines more comfortably. According to my clock, that is 51 minutes. So that's the first time I've done this talk. And I'm amazed because I'm usually rubbish with timing. So I'll stop there and we'll open this up to questions, comments, whatever. We've got 10 minutes. We can go on a bit longer. And by the way, if you don't want to, or you haven't got time now to ask questions, you're welcome to email me with comments and questions at any time. Thanks very much. Thank you.